So tell us a little bit about your background because I know you worked in the George W. Bush administration, you worked in the Obama administration, and now you're currently working with the Biden administration around IP, around who owns what kind of intellectual property, legalities, and regulations around that. How did you get involved in that in the first place?
So it wasn't a linear path. Uh, I'll start before me. My father grew up very poor in a very small village in Colombia. Grew up speaking no English, and he came to the United States on a program that the U.S. government had to study here. And as part of that program, he was stationed in Korea, but he was also, happily for me, he was stationed in a place called Fort Belvoir, which is very close to Washington, D.C. And so while he was at Fort Belvoir, he had the opportunity to visit Washington, D.C. He thought it was a beautiful city. And he told himself that if he had the opportunity to stay in the United States, that Washington, D.C. was the place that he wanted to be and where he wanted to raise a family. So I grew up in Washington, D.C., but not political at all. My family was not political. I never thought that I would do anything political. I actually thought I would be an immigration lawyer, was what I thought I would be. One of the things about growing up, DC is a very international city. And I think because of being in DC and because of my father's experience, I had a very good sense of what the United States means in the world and how the United States matters in the world and how the example that the United States shows the world, how that matters to people across the world. And that was the reason that I became a trade negotiator, because I believe, for the Bush administration, because I believe then, and I still do, that our trade agenda is really about building alliances with other countries. And that is extremely important, I think, for the world when it is done right. So I became a trade negotiator for the Bush administration. I set up the Intellectual Property Innovation Office at the White House there. And then President Obama asked me to come serve in the White House, advising him on intellectual property, set up a new startup, tiny office in the White House that was coordinating what the US government would do on intellectual property. I left the White House. That was an amazing experience. I left the White House and I came to be the CEO of the Business Software Alliance. And in that capacity, I work with governments around the world, but I was also asked to serve on President Biden's AI Advisory Committee. So I now advise the US government and the administration on artificial intelligence.
Amazing, amazing.
So very lucky.
Thank you. So many of the folks here in the room, they might see you as wearing a legal hat in what you just described, and they're used to hearing the word no from legal all the time. It's their favorite thing is to say, let's ask legal. And from their chair, it goes into a black hole, and the answer's no. And they probably don't like your department very much. It's true. So what are you considering when someone in this crowd says, hey, we're exploring generative AI, just use ChatGPT or Copilot, as we saw demonstrated earlier as an example, and they say, here, this is something we want to use, we want to do this. What is the process that you actually go through on your side of the fence to make sure that we're drawing the correct boxes around these technologies and not stifling innovation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So right now, I'm CEO of the Business Software Alliance. For people who don't know, that is a consortium. It's a group of enterprise software companies. So we represent about 40 enterprise software companies around the world. And our mission is to make sure that there is a legal regulatory environment around the world that lets our members execute on their business strategy, that removes barriers that would stop them from executing on that strategy and creates opportunities for them. So we are all about how do we get to yes? How do we help our members do what it is that they want to do? It is, and I will say happily in my experience in this job, very rare that a member or a company will come to us with an idea that we think maybe isn't the best approach. And when that happens, much like being a trade negotiator, I would say, I think our job is to figure out what is the goal? Because it's often the approach or the idea is not the goal. Like there's a business strategy element that they're trying to accomplish. So what we try to do is understand, what is that? Where are you trying to take this? Why is this important to you inside the company? What do you think you're going to accomplish? And then is there another way that it could be done that we think would be a better approach? So that is how we approach it. I think my board, many of them are chief legal officers, and many of them, I think, are great strategic advisors to their CEOs. But the last thing I'll say, we are in a really interesting moment because what you just described, there's a lot of the rules haven't been written yet. And that is really complicated, and it's very challenging. So it's not a matter of saying, okay, well, here's an idea. Let's go look at the law and see, can you do it, can you not? That situation does not exist. The rules have not been written yet, but they are being written. And so a lot of companies that we work with, a lot of our members, are figuring out what the rules are going to be internally, and that is driven less by what the law says and more by how do they want to approach it. So responsible AI is a great example of this. A lot of our companies have thought a lot about where do we want to come down in terms of the spectrum of responsible AI development and deployment. And given what we want to do as a company, what are the rules that we create for ourselves internally? Then you layer over the fact that there are rules coming, and it's a challenging and very interesting situation.
How do you balance that kind of forward look and wanting to create some form of standard, some form of framework, with the fact that so many different geopolitical entities, I'll take like Italy as an example, went to one far end of a spectrum and said, hey, no AI usage. I won't call it a fear-based approach, but it's a very, very cautious, very conservative approach. And some are more freewheeling. When you're dealing with international corporations, many of the companies here are dealing with international laws and rules. The European Union has different rules than the United States, has different rules than Australia, right? So how do you balance those geopolitical pulls and pushes with what you're trying to build?
It's a great question. It's one of the biggest challenges that we deal with every day. At Business Software Alliance, we have offices around the world, so we're working with governments directly around the world. I was in Australia recently. I was in Brussels. I'm going to be heading to London and Delhi soon. And we have great teams on the ground that are working with those governments. And a big part, one of our primary goals as an organization is to try to ensure there's as much global consistency as possible, because we know for our companies, and for those that are developing the software, the lack of clarity and inconsistency is one of the most difficult things. Now, obviously, you want that regulation to also be workable, but trying to have it be as consistent as possible is very important, and we spend an enormous amount of time on that. I will say that I think that there is an opportunity around AI regulation that I've never seen exist before. And what I mean by that is, in the many years that I've been working on technology policy, I've never seen an issue where you have so many governments focused on it at the same moment. So that in itself is very unusual. And ChatGPT, November 2022, AI has been around for a long time, but all of a sudden policymakers were like, this is something that we're really interested in. I think because the capabilities of ChatGPT made it much more concrete for policymakers who are people too. And so there has been this enormous rush of interest from governments around the world. At the same time, many of them realize that they don't understand the technology as much as they want to. And so there is a real interest in working with us, but also working with each other, with governments working with other governments to try to come up with approaches that are similar. And that's an enormous opportunity. And again, one I've never seen before in my career. So there's summits that have been happening that you might have heard about, like at Bletchley Park in London. France is planning one. Actually, the United States is pulling together a group of safety institutes that governments have set up in San Francisco in just a couple of weeks. But I think there's a real chance at trying and having rules that are relatively consistent, at least among a significant group of countries. It won't be every country, but among a significant group of countries.
Amazing news.
And by the way, not a chance that will last forever. Policymakers will move on, and they'll make decisions and they'll move on. So I feel like we have like 12 to 18 months to really take advantage of that.
So that's amazing news. In kind of historically, and some of us are old enough to remember, kind of the first peaking of open source usage and kind of some of the Wild West that it created. When you come in with rules and regulations and we hear stifle of innovation in our brains, it's your point of view, you told me, that that can actually increase innovation, that the regulation and drawing of those borders and documenting some of these things can actually encourage innovation and really drive widespread adoption of technologies. Tell me about that, because that seems counterintuitive.
So I definitely agree with that. I think, so I mean, and to be clear, like they need to be workable rules, right? Otherwise it's not going to work. But I think if you're speaking about, let's talk about Gen AI, but it's really true of any kind of technology, such a big part of it, and we heard this actually from some of the speakers today, is trust. Is the customer base trusting that technology is going to do what they want it to do, and it's going to do it in a way that is safe and responsible. And I think it is much easier for that to be accomplished if there are guardrails that are giving the developers and the engineers some sort of parameters. I think it speeds the process internally, overall, because you're not going down roads that are eventually going to lead to dead ends. But I think it's enormously important in terms of adoption. And in fact, one of the things that I worry about is that if we don't have those sort of workable guardrails, it's going to slow adoption of artificial intelligence because customers aren't going to trust it.
So what do you feel is your finger in the wind of what you can share, being on all of these committees and as part of all of these initiatives? What's kind of thematically coming down the road? You offered maybe, over the next 12 to 18 months, there's a window here. What does that look like in your opinion?
So I would say a few things. There's been a lot of work done, including by us, on risk management programs internally, impact assessments, and requiring those. In fact, at BSA back in 2019, which now seems so long ago, we put out a fairly detailed 50-page framework on software development to try to reduce the risk of bias in artificial intelligence. And since then, a number of governments, including the United States government through the Department of Commerce, have put out frameworks that are similar to that. And while they aren't laws, they are, for example, I know that the US government is thinking about having that NIST framework for software development adopted by many of the agencies of the US government. And procurement is a very powerful tool that governments have. If the US government decides that this is a standard for procurement, they know that that can drive behavior inside, of course, to those that want to sell to the government, but outside that as well. And there are a number of governments, not just the United States, that are looking at impact assessment and risk management tools and requirements for those. So I think that is something that has, if I sat here a year ago, I would say I thought that was, I think we're now past the point where I'd even say that's likely. I think that's coming, and it's just a matter of sort of timing for different governments. The good news there is that I think there is a relatively consistent approach there among many governments, and we've certainly been encouraging governments to work together with each other, so those sorts of impact assessment requirements are relatively similar. Here are a couple of other things that I think are coming that, that hopefully I'll be sitting here, a year from now saying, this is also working out in a relatively consistent way. I think there's a lot of concern about abuse of material and what companies should be doing to try to avoid that. But there are not legal government standards and rules for that. So this is an area where companies are having to make their own decisions about how, what prompts they're going to use internally, what they consider to be the acceptable results of those prompts, and then ship product without having guidance from the government. And I think this is a good example of actually where companies say, like, I would rather have some guidance from the government than be making these decisions internally. And I think that is something that governments are very focused on. So I think that is something that may be coming. I think, and this is probably a little bit more of a focus in the United States and Europe than in other major markets in Asia, for example. But I think generally, the concern about displaced workers in artificial intelligence has been there for many, many years, right? Like that is not a new issue. But there are new flavors of it, particularly in the Gen AI world. And it has, so one, for example, you mentioned IP. The creative communities, I think, are very concerned about Gen AI. Actors, writers, directors, musicians are very concerned about Gen AI and what it's going to do to their ability to have a livelihood and to be compensated for what they create. And I think that issue is one that 100% is coming in the United States and in the European Commission. The European Commission is going through a big election now, but they're going to have their new, essentially their new administration in place in January. And that issue in Europe, in Japan, in Australia, and the United States, I think is going to be very active. You might, depending upon what you do, you might be sitting there and say, well, like, that's not relevant to me. But the problem with regulation is that it is not always drafted to be as precise as it should be. And so a big concern that governments have is Gen AI going to undermine creative communities, can lead them to put in place mandates for how software is developed that have consequences that go far beyond the particular issue that they're trying to solve. And so I think, I am very concerned about that. To be clear, I think creative communities should absolutely be compensated for what they do. But one of the things that we do at the Business Software Alliance is try to make sure that when governments have a legitimate objective that they're trying, that they craft policy that addresses that objective and doesn't create problems for software development that have nothing to do with that objective.
We have time for one question that came to me earlier from the audience for you, which is, for software developers and development teams, where does that idea of IP and the use of generative AI into products, and then how your products and data are being used to train those same models, maybe within, maybe without your organization, at the end of the day, it seems really munged with who owns what and who wrote that code and where it came from, and there's both IP issues and liability issues that can come with that. So how does that balance out with usage of these types of technology with, at the end of the day, it works, but did I build that? Did somebody else build that? Right. And if something goes wrong, like we saw some bad examples of models being trained poorly or intentionally poorly and delivering whether racist or sexist or just terrible messages and results, who is liable for that at the end of the day?
That's the abuse of material part, or it's an aspect of it. So that's a big, big question. This is what I would say. And it's one that we're very much involved with and working with our companies on. And a lot of our companies, it's very top of mind for many of them. Part of what I think that is the industry coming together to decide how to deal with that responsibly. So, I mentioned that we had worked on this framework to try to reduce bias in AI. We worked on a very influential framework on how to develop software in a way that is as secure as possible. So we are working with our companies now on what are the practices they can put in place internally to try to avoid those types of negative outcomes. It is both an input and an output problem, as you know. So there are a lot of concerns about training data. Where is it coming from? Is it violative of copyright, or is it in some other way unfair to be training on that data, even if it's not a technical violation of the copyright law? So that is a big debate, and there's active litigation going on, and there's a lot of government interest in that. And then there's the output issue. What is being created by generative AI? Is that copyright violation, or is it abusive material that we don't want to have out in our society? And then how is information about the different models shared down that chain? I think I shared with you, that is a very active conversation we are having with our companies right now. You have developers, you have deployers, you have those that are sitting in the middle. What types of information need to be shared? Who should they be shared with? What are the effective ways to share that information so you all understand how the models operate and you can use them in a way that's effective? So I think we relatively soon, because it's such a top focus for us, are going to have some answers for that. But I will say this. I think one of the things that I worry about, as I said, is government sort of reacting to a really bad set of circumstances or a really bad set of facts and deciding to put regulations in place because they are very concerned about a particular instance. And I think that is very, very real here. So stepping back from the specifics of any particular law, I think what we need to make sure is that governments are focused on the outcomes that they want to achieve as a society, not putting mandates in place for software development. And that balance is hard because a lot of times, there will be an impulse by certain governments to rush to mandates quickly. I think we've been successful in making sure that doesn't happen, but it's also very important that I think we as a community are doing what we can internally to make sure what we are producing doesn't violate societal outcomes that are important to our values.